Yes, welcome everyone. Today is the 19th of August, 2022. My name is Glenn Diesen. I'm a professor at the University of Southeastern Norway. And with me is the always excellent Alexander Mercouris from the Duran. And last but not least, we have Scott Ritter, former US Marine Corps intelligence officer, military expert, intelligence expert, and also, of course, an American patriot. Many probably familiar with Scott Ritter as UN weapons inspector, who have overseen the disarmament of weapons of mass destruction. And I guess publicly you argue that Iraq had no WMDs before the war, and well, if people had listened to you then, I assume many lives would have been spared. And I also believe that many lives would have been spared if our leaders would have listened to you about this current crisis in Ukraine as well, a war which could seemingly very easily have been avoided. So, Scott Ritter, this is a real pleasure.
Well, thank you very much for having me. And Alexander, it's great to see you again.
Yeah, mutually, absolutely.
So, let's just jump into it, I guess. I was thinking the narrative of the West concerning this war in Ukraine, it continues to change, from unfettered optimism to more pessimism, which seems to have set in now. But the big questions, I guess, is what is the state of the Russian military? Because we keep saying it's all powerful, it's just a corrupt flop. But if Russia has such a powerful military, many people are asking why hasn't Russia been able to defeat the Ukrainians?
And who are you throwing that at?
I'm sorry. You, Scott.
Okay. Look. Let's start off by just stating a statement of fact. Russia is not 10 feet tall. The Russian soldier is not a Superman. They are capable of making mistakes. They have made mistakes. They will continue to make mistakes. And that's just the way it is. So this notion that Russia is, somehow this perfect war machine that's just, do no wrong, and therefore, why on earth haven't they won this war already? What an absurdity. Ukraine started this conflict with the second largest military in Europe after Turkey. It was one of the most well-trained militaries in Europe, one of the best equipped militaries in Europe, one of the best led militaries in Europe, and because of the ongoing conflict in eastern Ukraine, it was one of the most combat experienced armies in Europe. Let me put it another way. If the Ukrainian army fought against the German army, it would have destroyed the Germans. The Ukrainian army would have crushed the Polish army. The Ukrainian army would have swept the floor with the Romanian army, with the French army, with the Italian army. That's how good the Ukrainians were and are. Very professional, very well trained, very motivated, by the way. So the notion that Russia was going to come into Ukraine and somehow just wipe this very capable military force aside is absurd. And we saw this. We saw Russia initiate this conflict using a plan of action that I think underestimated Ukraine's capabilities. We saw Russia send flying columns forward with little regard to flank security and rear security. And the Ukrainians were successful in ambushing many of these columns and inflicting heavy casualties on the Russians. This is just a statement of fact. But what Russia has is a very well-trained military of its own, possessing, a very competent doctrine, led by some of the best trained officers, the best trained officer corps in the world, people who understand the art of war, and a military that has increasingly become professional in character, transitioning away from this conscript-based military that maybe was dominating back in the early 2000s up until maybe 2008. But the 5-day war with Georgia was a big wake-up call for the Russians about the inadequacy of their training, their equipment, their doctrine. What we have is a Russian military that knows what it's doing. And the biggest sign of a professional is the ability to adapt well under adversity. And the Russians went in with with one way of doing things, and quickly realized that they needed to adapt, that the Ukrainians were very competent, and that Russia needed to change its methodology. And they did so by focusing on the primary problem confronting them, which was this heavily entrenched Ukrainian force defending eastern Ukraine, defending the areas of the Donbass that were under Ukrainian control for the last 8 years. And I need to emphasize that, heavily entrenched. This is a Ukrainian military that's been dug in to, some of the most extensive trench works that have been seen since World War I, with reinforced concrete blockhouses, positions. If you make a move on one position, you're getting hit by others. Their artillery has registered every square inch of this, so that when the Russians come to a particular piece of ground, the Ukrainians already have the firing solution figured out. And if they have artillery available, they're able to bring artillery to bear on this piece. So this is an extraordinarily difficult military problem. And the Russians have been able to come up with what I would say the perfect storm of military capability to solve this problem. They have taken full advantage of their overwhelming superiority, I would even say supremacy in artillery, to create a methodology of conflict that focuses on executing the mission without any time constraint. And this is sort of unique in military history. Almost every time a war is fought, military commanders are under time pressures to accomplish a mission. You need to take Hill 861 by 1,500 hours on the third day. And so lives are sacrificed in the interest of getting this objective on time. The Russians have removed the calendar from the equation. They don't care about time. All they care about is accomplishing the objective, which is to inflict maximum casualties on the Ukrainians with minimum casualties on the part of Russia. And they have come up with a way of operating that is doing just that. They are grinding their way through eastern Ukraine, inflicting unheard of casualty ratios. Normally in war, an attacker wants a 3-to-1 advantage, numerical advantage over the defender. So for every single Ukrainian dug in, there should be 3 Russians. And then you're going to get through this attacking a casualty ratio that roughly is 1-to-1. I mean, historically, some of the biggest battles that are fought in modern history, in World War II, et cetera, you have casualty ratios of 1 to 1.2, 1.4, which means that the 100,000 of you are fighting 100,000 of them. There's going to be a battle, and eventually you're going to grind it down to where you have about 80,000 of you left. There's about 60,000 of them left, and they realize that you've achieved the superiority. They start to withdraw, or they retreat, or they surrender. The Russians right now are achieving casualty ratios. I don't mean to laugh, because this is war and people are dying, and I don't mean to minimize this, but I have to just say, as a military man, to go on the offensive against a dug-in enemy like this, and to achieve casualty ratios of 10, 15, 20, sometimes 30-to-1 is unheard of in military matters. And I think increasingly people in the West are starting to look at this. A lot of Western military observers were looking at the Russians early on, and they were a little dismayed, because we had all been raised in the operational military mobility group, this brigade-sized, division-sized tank force that was going to break through the line, get into the rear area, big sweeping arrows. And when the Russians didn't do that, we're all like, they're overhyped. They're not as good as they thought they were, as we thought they were. And now we're basically recalibrating, going, these guys are really good, really good. They're fantastic. I wouldn't want to go up against them, because these guys have mastered the art of war in which they have maximized all of their strengths while exploiting every weakness of the enemy. Anecdotally, we hear the Ukrainians say, we go to the front lines ready to fight the Russians. We're ready, we're prepared. We get to the front lines and we spend the next few days getting slammed by artillery. We lose 50, 60% of our force, so they pull us out. We never saw a Russian. How demoralizing is that for an enemy? If you want to engage in close combat, your enemy, you go to the front line, you suffer horrific casualties, and you never saw the enemy. This is the reality of war. And then when they do see them, it's usually after you've been pulverized into nothing, and now you have these well-trained light infantry forces supported by armor coming into the trenches and digging you out with bayonets and grenades and rifle fire, and it's a clean sweep. So the Russians are doing fantastic on the battlefield, but they don't care about the clock. They don't care about the calendar. They are going to accomplish their missions in a way that maximizes Ukrainian losses, minimizes their. And I'll just finish with this. You know, there's some documents that were leaked out of the Ministry of Defense, Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, that suggest that I think the end of June, early July, that the Ukrainian armed forces had suffered 191,000 casualties. 191,000. That's just the Army. That doesn't include the Air Force, Border Guards, and other forces. When you factor in everybody, the total number of casualties is around 250,000 casualties. That's a number actually that I have been throwing out for a while, saying that when I look, you know, I'm not going to claim that I'm, you know, God's gift to anything. I'm not. But I've studied war and I've been at war long enough to where I'm able to do what's called military math in my head. I can take a look at an array of forces. I can look at the firepower available, the doctrine available, the terrain, blink my eyes 4 or 5 times while the algorithm runs in my head, and they say, this is the anticipated outcome at this cost. And when I took a look at what was going on in Eastern Ukraine, I said, you know, that by the summer of this year, Ukraine would have suffered 250,000 casualties. And it turns out that's exactly what they've suffered. Now, that's not dead. That's 250,000 casualties. But of that 250,000, you're looking at between 70 and 80,000 killed in action. That's a lot. That's a whole bunch. That doesn't mean that the Russians haven't suffered casualties themselves. They have. My clicking of my military math suggests that the combined Allied casualties for the Russians is around 15,000 dead. And they were probably looking at in the area of maybe 25 to 30,000, maybe up to 40,000 wounded. So 55,000 Russian casualties total. Now, most of those casualties took place early on in the conflict. Whereas with the Ukrainians, I mean, the Ukrainians have always suffered more casualties than the Russians. But if you graph it out, what you have is the Russians starting here at casualties, and then their casualty figures are dropping down, nearly flatlining as close to zero as you can get today. And the Ukrainian casualties were always up here, but they've gone and now they're spiking. And so even though these numbers suggest that, you know, there's, you know, some sort of, I'm not going to say equality, but there's, you know, that the Ukrainians are given as good as they're taking. That's not true today, because the graph today would show Ukrainian casualties spiking way up here, Russian casualties flatlining down here, and the war is only going to progress in a manner that's worse for the Ukrainians. So, you know, in July, August of 1943, there was a great battle in the Soviet Union during World War II called Kursk. When the battle ended, I don't think there was a military expert on either side, the German side or the Soviet side, that didn't recognize that Germany had lost the war. It was over. Mm-hmm. This was in, say, July, August 1943. Now, there were still nearly 2 years of war left. So even though the war was lost, it didn't mean the war was over. Ukraine lost this war in May. They lost it when Mariupol fell. Because when Mariupol fell, what we had is the Russians perfecting the formula that was repeatable on the battlefield. And there was nothing that was going to change that outcome. No amount of military aid provided by the West, no amount of mobilization on the part of the Ukrainians was going to change this outcome. There's still a lot of fighting left. There's a lot of Ukrainians left to be killed, a lot of territory left to be taken, and unfortunately, a lot of Russians that are still going to be killed and wounded themselves. I'm not trying to pretend that the war is finished, but the war's over. Russia won. There's nothing that's going to happen that's going to change that.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, well, I was just wondering though how you see, because it feels like the war is kind of entering this new phase. Because as you mentioned in the beginning, Russia was kind of carelessly storming towards Kiev, with this very thin, long-stretched supply lines, which made them very vulnerable. But it seems to me that after Boris Johnson paid a visit to Kiev during the Ukrainian and Russian peace negotiations and effectively told them that United Kingdom and the United States would supply Ukraine with all the weapons it would need if it only walked away from this peace agreement, from this negotiation table with the Russians. And I guess, well, from our perspective, this seemed to have changed the war, because until then it looked like the Russians didn't really want to inflict that much damage or minimal damage on Ukraine as possible. But after this happened, it seemed like the war went into a war of attrition, where effectively destroying the enemy's military. But again, that's been going on for a few months now. But it seems now we're coming to this stage where the Ukrainian army appears to be breaking down, because just over the past 2-3 weeks, we see the main front line and north of Donetsk city, and also on the west, that is Ugledar, Marinka, Pieski, Avdiivka, now also Bakhmut appearing to fall. Is this these were their main defense lines? Is this like this, are we entering a new stage? Do you think moving from attrition to more increased territorial control? That's actually to the both of you.
Well, Alexander, I spoke long enough, so you can take this one.
let me make a few comments first about what you said, Scott, if you don't mind. Can I just say, I think you've got everything I'm hearing, the casualty figures that you've discussed are about the right ones. And you said that, Ukraine would have beaten the Western armies, just the West European armies. The British army, the British Land Army, I believe numbers around 80,000 men. So we are talking about, by June, 190,000 Ukrainian casualties. That is, you can do the maths, and it's much more than the British ground army. And I've actually heard people say this in Britain. They were saying that even before those numbers that were leaked out by the Ukrainian military, that the Ukrainians have lost more men than the British army has to deploy on a battlefield. And I think that, if I can also say, turning attrition against the defender, attrition is supposed to work in favor of the defense. And at least that's what everybody in London seemed to assume. And I can remember this period of wild optimism in April. They were saying to themselves, well, they haven't got Kiev. They're going to attack in Donbass. Donbass is as heavily defended as exactly as you said. The Russians will not be able to break this because the Ukrainians are so well entrenched. The Ukrainian military, turns out, is very strong. And I think this is a factor, by the way, which people had underestimated. I certainly underestimated it. And I think it's also a reason, by the way, why there was a war in the first place, because the Russians undoubtedly were becoming increasingly concerned by this military buildup in Ukraine, and they were getting very worried about it. But putting all that aside, I think there was this big optimism in London. Certainly, probably in Washington too. They were saying to themselves, the Russians will not be able to win a war of attrition. The numbers are too heavily stacked against them. And what they've seen is attrition reversing itself. It's the Ukrainians who are suffering the attrition, not the Russians. And I think that there is a quiet, growing horror at the sheer scale of this artillery war, which the British military, at least, has had no real conception of up till this point. And now I often say this, and I say this again, I have no military background, none whatsoever. I've never been in any army. I've never served in uniform. I know officers, military officers, but never, never took an interest in military affairs. I have some knowledge, a lot of knowledge of logistics. And as a sheer logistical exercise, getting all that artillery moving, keeping it supplied with, rounds of ammunition, pouring them out at this sort of level, day after day, week after week, launching all of those missiles. It is staggering. It is a staggering industrial effort. It is a staggering organizational effort. It is one which here in Britain, at least, I could say definitely we are no longer capable of. I think if the United States bent all its resources to do it, it can do it. But no European country by itself could, or even collectively could. And we've seen all the ammunition supplies in the West, the stocks, they've all been run down. In July, Europe stopped sending arms to Ukraine in any number anymore, because we simply cannot sustain this type of war. And it's a war of attrition that's working not just against Ukraine, incredibly, and this is something nobody expected, it's also working against us, by which I mean the militaries in Europe, and which we have no answer for. So I just wanted to make those observations, building on the things that Scott says. If Scott wants to take issue with any of this, then obviously, he will.
The last point there. I remember the Chechen leader Kadyrov. He was making the point that after we demilitarize Ukraine, we're going to demilitarize NATO. I thought, he tends to be somewhat bombastic in his language, but there's something to this. I mean, we have across Europe, we've depleted a lot of our storage, military storage, and it's all being shipped. And we see now the numbers dropping, not necessarily because our policy changed, but we don't have the guns anymore. And even if we did, we don't seem to be able to supply weapons fast enough that the Ukrainians are losing them. So it does seem to be very much a losing battle. But again, this is why it's a bit frustrating that it continues. We continue to go down the war, even though, as Scott said, the war has been lost, but it's not over yet. It feels like we passed that point a long time ago, yet we keep fighting.
Indeed,
Yeah,
yes. Now, can I? Scott,
Alexander, go.
Well, I just want to say a few things, a few quick things. First of all, I am deeply ashamed at the role my country played back in March in aborting what looked to me like a promising possibility of a negotiated solution to this war. No doubt we'll be saying more about that, but I'm deeply, deeply upset by this. But coming back to the points that you were making before, Glenn, your question about the fact that the war seems to be changing direction. I'm going to defer to Scott on the military, but I do also get the sense that attrition is now reaching that point where over the horizon you can see that attrition is going to have its effect. No military can surely absorb the kind of damage that Ukraine has been experiencing day after day, week after week. No society can. There's growing information that there are increasing economic strains within Ukraine as well. There's the clear evidence of an inflation crisis starting to build there. We've had comments from teams of economists, including Ken Rogoff, by the way, who's very well-known Harvard economist. They're telling Ukraine, you cannot sustain your spending at the rate that you can't print money to cover your war expenses in the way that you're doing. If you do, you're going to be facing severe inflation problems. The governor of the Ukraine Central Bank has now come out and said exactly the same. He said that the government in Kiev must cut its spending. How does a government in the middle of a war cut its spending? I mean, it is impossible. What they've been asked to do points to only one logical way forward, which is to negotiate peace. And that's the one thing that the government in Kiev seems structurally incapable of doing. So I do sense that we're coming to the point probably within the next few weeks, months, timelines are not something I'm going to indulge in here, but I suspect we're starting to see attrition have its effect in terms of bringing this war closer to its conclusion. And I think I'm right in saying, certainly the case, by the way, I mean, again, my background, as you probably all know, it's a legal one, but legal battles, litigation can have an attrition quality sometimes. And what sometimes happens in that, and I suspect it's probably the true in war as well, is that a point comes when one side becomes exhausted and then the collapse is sudden. And I wonder whether we could see something like that in Ukraine too. When I say a sudden collapse, I don't mean a total collapse right across the board, but we could start to see things in Donbass, for example, end fairly dramatically, in eastern Ukraine and fairly dramatically. And there's all sorts of people on the front lines. Russia, Ukraine too, has some amazing war reporters, by the way, very brave ones. But they're basically, what they all seem to be saying is that once the defense lines in Donbass are all broken, the only remaining viable defense line is the Dnieper River. And that there really isn't anything there would be nothing at that point to stand in the way of a Russian advance to the Dnieper River. And of course, if the Russians get to the Dnieper River, then essentially Ukraine is cut in two, and its ability to sustain the war from that point on becomes, at least as far as I can see, very, very problematic. So that you're asking the point about, where is this war heading and the change in direction. I hope I've just made my own thoughts about that clear. Scott.
I'm done. Alexander just answered everything masterfully. There's nothing more to talk about. No, I agree 100%. If you'll allow me to indulge in a little bit of storytelling, but it is related to this. When I was in an artillery battalion when I first joined the Marine Corps as a lowly second lieutenant, and I had the audacity, when called before my commanding officer, he said, "What is the role of an intelligence officer?" Because he had just fired the two guys before I came in, and I said, "Intelligence drives operations. You guys can't do anything without me." He said, "Do you really believe that?" I said, "Yes, sir, I do." And he said, "Good. You're responsible for the annual training plan." A second lieutenant has now been given responsibility to build the annual training plan for the free world's largest self-propelled artillery battalion, 5th Battalion, 11th Marines, that consisted of 5 firing batteries. And when I said, "Okay, I'll take that," but when I came in, the way we did artillery was World War II style, with direct support artillery battalions working with the general support battalion providing fires to the division. But it was very linear. And when I took a look at Soviet capabilities, because we were training to fight the Soviets, I said, we're going to lose like on day 3. If we try to do this, we try to stand toe to toe with the Soviets, we're going to lose. And this was when the Marine Corps was buying into maneuver warfare. And so adapting some of those principles, I came up with an annual training plan that brought in a lot of maneuvering, a lot of, dispersing your forces, concentrating fire, having mobile counter battery capability. And the idea was to trade space, space and attrit the enemy until you could get a decisive point when you could hit them. And we trained for this I was there for 2.5 years. But one of the interesting things, you spoke of logistics. This new kind of war, what we found out is, first of all, back then the Marine Corps, we trained as we fought. So it was all live fire out in 29 Park, California, in the desert. And the ammunition expenditure rates went through the roof. And headquarters Marine Corps came down and said, you can't justify this. And I had to write a paper, again, now as a first lieutenant, explaining why we had to do this or else we were going to lose the war. And I convinced them. But my point is, the ammunition expenditure rates went through the roof. And still, with all that, as we war gamed it out, eventually, no matter how good we were, we just didn't have enough. Even if we did everything right, even if we did the perfect trading of time for maneuver to get an advantage, et cetera, eventually our 5 batteries would be attritted down without doing significant attrition to their artillery capability, and they would overwhelm us, and we'd have to go nuclear at the end. That was the only way we could forestall. So no matter what we did, we always had to go nuclear. And this was the United States Marine Corps, and I don't mean to brag too much, but there wasn't anybody better than us, and there never will be anybody better than us. We were the ultimate warriors, and I'm sure the Marines today feel the same thing, totally dedicated to the art of war. And it wasn't good enough. It wasn't good enough. And now we have the Ukrainians that are not nearly as good as the Marines. They're professional, but not. I can guarantee you that their military never trained to the level that we trained back in the 1980s in terms of live fire, maneuver, constantly in the field. And now they're going up against the Russians, who similarly weren't as well trained as we are, but the Russians have mastered this. And you're right, logistically, this isn't an accident what's happening here. You know, the Russians didn't roll in to this war thinking, oh, we're going to win it in 3 months, therefore that's all the ammunition that we've stockpiled. Actually, the Russians have been planning for this for years. For years, they have increased their allocation of resources to acquire munitions. They've stockpiled them, not just artillery, but we're talking about the precision guided munitions, the caliber missiles, the Onyx missiles. They haven't run out of those. Alexander, you know this, back in April, they're going to run out of caliber missiles. You don't seem to be running out of caliber missiles.
The Daily Telegraph was telling us in March they would, within 2 weeks.
They got nothing. They got no. Well, they got everything, dude. They're coming at you, and it's never going to end. You brought up NATO and Kadyrov's statement that they're going to demilitarize NATO. Think about it. It's not just that they've and Alexander, we talk about the 191. I call it closer to 250,000 casualties is more than twice the British Army. It's exactly the number of dead Ukrainians exactly matches the size of the British Army. So the Russians have killed as many Ukrainians as exist in the British Army. And that's something to chew on for a second. Demilitarization of NATO. NATO has gutted itself in an attempt to supply the Ukrainians, provide them with it. So the first part of that statement, let's parse that out. That means that Russia, before we talk about what NATO has provided Ukraine, Russia has defeated the arsenal in totality of the second largest army in Europe, the existing arsenal, the thousands of tanks, the thousands of artillery pieces, the hundreds of aircraft that Ukraine possessed prior to NATO opening up its barracks and its arsenals. That has been defeated, destroyed, annihilated. That's stunning in its own right, because the amount of equipment Russia has destroyed, when you compare to what NATO has in their arsenals, means that they're fully capable of destroying what NATO had. But now NATO has gutted themselves by giving significant quantities of equipment to the Ukrainian army, which has been destroyed by the Russians. So it's not as though Ukrainian military has successfully reconstituted itself to be bigger, badder, and better with all this new NATO equipment. They're still getting crushed. The NATO equipment's being destroyed. So Russia has won the war twice. They defeated the Ukrainian military as it was originally organized and equipped, and they defeated the new Ukrainian military that's been given all this equipment by NATO. And now some NATO nations have stopped providing equipment altogether because they don't have anything left to provide unless they want to go to zero capability. So Russia has demilitarized NATO. The fact of the matter is right now, while Russia will be able to sustain the current rate of artillery fire, which is around 60, 70,000 rounds a day, a quick hint, the Gulf War, which I fought in against Iraq in 1991 during the ground combat phase, the United States fired 60,000 rounds for the entire Gulf War. The Russians expend that in one day. So let's chew on that for a second as we then roll into the next thing. NATO, let me throw this one in. you don't build an army overnight. And Alexander, you hinted at this. You talked about, the capacity to produce ammunition, et cetera. Even let's say NATO magically produced 200 billion euro right now. They got it. They don't have it, but they have 200 billion magical euros. This isn't a war game, a computer game where, oh, we've accumulated enough resources, click the button. Oh, look, we've accumulated. We're building tanks. We're building tanks. We're building airplanes. We're building artillery. No, your industrial base is not capable of doing that. Your industrial base operates off of a budget over time. So your legislature authorizes X amount of munitions to be produced over time. The industrial base fine-tunes itself and does that. Unless there's total mobilization, total transformation of the industrial base, that's all they can do. And that transformation takes time. It doesn't happen overnight. Europe is incapable of producing an arsenal that is capable of standing up to the Russian military. They will run out, the British, I think, there's been a lot of talk about it, would run out of ammunition in 2 weeks. No, they'll run out of ammunition before 2 weeks because, first of all, that implies that Britain is going to be able to sustain a rate of fire with a certain number of troops over the course of 2 weeks. You're going to lose your entire army in less than that. Okay, so you won't have any troops left to expend ammunition, but your ammunition depots are going to be destroyed. Your logistics are going to be destroyed coming up. The Russians are going to dominate you in the full spectrum of the battlefield. And this is all of NATO, even the United States. We're running out of HIMARS rounds. The HIMARS is supposed to be this magic weapon that we have that we developed that we could break back of a Russian style military. Well, that's wonderful in a perfect world, but we don't have any more HIMARS rounds. We've given them all to the Ukrainians and they've all been blown up. So yeah, NATO has been demilitarized. And when this war ends, and it will end, we're going to see a Russian military that has perfected the art of war, which includes not just how to kill the enemy on the front line, but how to logistically sustain this, how to do this and in control. And they're going to be confronting a NATO which has gutted itself, doesn't have any sustainability, and still lacks a military capable of fighting the kind of war that Russia has. Now, is the war going to change? Yes. When they break through the defenses, the nature of war is going to change. There's no doubt about that. But I would caution against anybody thinking about a dramatic breakout. And the reason why I say that is this: study history. Operation Bagration took place in the summer of 1944. The destruction of Army Group Center, one of the most horrific collapses of military cohesiveness in modern history, where the German Army Group Center basically got overwhelmed by the Soviets, and suddenly you see the big arrows going forward, and it looks really, really good on paper, big arrows. But you know what came with those big arrows? Big casualties, huge casualties. Big arrows don't happen for free. Big arrows are expensive, and the Russians, I don't believe, are willing to pay this price. So even though the opportunity may avail itself for some big arrow moments, I still think that the Russians will seek to adapt this attrition warfare that they've done. It'll probably be done at a higher pace of operations, but what they will seek to do is continually provide the Ukrainians the opportunity to pause for the cause, to consolidate. And then the Russians will likewise pause, grind them down, and then move on to the next pause. And so I think we'll be seeing sort of, instead of this steady grind, I think we're going to be seeing some jump forward, jump forward, jump forward, jump forward. But I don't think we're going to be seeing the big arrows, because big arrows bring big casualties. And one of the things that the Russians have appear to have embraced the notion of is minimize casualties. This is still a special military operation. They haven't mobilized. They're still dealing with the restrictions of a peacetime military. So they're not prepared to take the casualties that come with big sweeping offensive operation. And I bring that up because no matter what happens to the Ukrainians as they collapse and as they crumble, just like the German army in World War II, the Germans were still capable of pivoting on a dime and smacking the Russians if the Russians made a mistake, the Soviets. The Ukrainians are still capable of pivoting on a dime and punching the Russian in the face if the Russian gives them a chance to do so. So then that's the danger of big arrow war, because you open it up, and when you have a competent enemy, they can still do damage. And I don't think the Russians want to give the Ukrainians any opportunity to do damage. Lastly, though, this war is going to become a war of territorial acquisition. Once the defenses are rolled up, the Russians have made it clear that because of Ukraine's unwillingness to engage in responsible negotiations back in April, that the nature of the conflict has changed. And to put it in gross oversimplification, Ukraine has lost the right to rule over an ethnic Russian. I think that's about as simple as I can make it. Russia will never again allow the Ukrainians the opportunity to terrorize, murder, rape ethnic Russians the way that they have done in the past couple. The laws that have been passed by the Ukrainian parliament, banning the Russian language, outlawing Russian culture. I mean, these are laws that if you close your eyes and replace the word Russian with Jew, sounds like Nazi Germany in terms of its cancellation of a people, of a culture, of a race. No matter what happens, Ukraine has lost, in the minds of the Russians, I believe, lost any say on having any ability to govern an ethnic Russian. So they're going to lose Kharkov. They're going to lose Dnipropetrovsk. They're going to lose Nikolaev. They're going to lose Odessa. And I think we're going to see the creation of Novaya Russia, stretching from Transnistria up to Kharkov. This will be forever Russia. And the military operation, once they roll up the defenses, recapture the Donbass, will become a war of territorial acquisition where the Russians will define a specific territorial objective, and then they will accomplish it, consolidate, accomplish, with the goal of accomplishing their objectives with minimum casualties. This is the one thing I think has to be factored in. The Russians are not going to play big arrow games because Russia politically is not ready to take big arrow casualties, but they're going to win this war.
Good point. And I was going to ask, because there's some speculations now that you mentioned the Russians haven't gone beyond this format of a special military operation, like in terms of not mobilizing, but they have these referendums, which looks like they're going to go through next month. I think therefore if Kherson and Zaporozhye joins Russia, wouldn't this overcome the legal issue about about not deploying Russian troops in foreign lands? In other words, this would allow Russia to send a lot of conscripts as well, wouldn't it? And free up a lot of these troops, or is that something not restricted by law, just something they don't want to do necessarily in order to keep the casualties low?
I'm going to, if I can just say, I don't think they will send conscripts into this war. I don't think this is part of the agenda at all. I think what they will do is this. They will do exactly what Scott said. They will start to incorporate these territories into the Russian Federation. And that is going to have a legal effect because, of course, the moment these territories become part of the Russian Federation, attacks on them become attacks on Russia itself. But I think that what we will see is two things happen. Firstly, I think that you will see the Russians will start to recruit in these areas. In fact, they already are. There's already reports that have been trickling through. It's not very clear, but that there's already an Odessa brigade being formed apparently, and that there's going to be more of these units being developed. Not militia, but they'll be part of the regular Russian army, presumably. But with these territories, the Russians acquire a reserve manpower pool of people who have been ruled by Ukrainians, who have reasons not to be, friendly to Ukrainians because they've been discriminated against. This is something, by the way, in the West, people just will not accept. I mean, you just don't get this acceptance in the West that there's been this very severe discriminatory policy against Russians, but it is a fact, and it will have an effect. People will be prepared to enlist, to fight, to defend their territories, and to sign up into the Russian army to do it. And there's also rumors, and again I stress these are rumors, but they're so widely spread rumors that I'm sure that there's truth in them, that all sorts of volunteer brigades, in other words reservists, are being recruited back in Russia to build up infantry manpower, essentially. I think the one thing that the Russians have been short of in this war, Scott knows more about this than I do, but is infantry. But they will gradually bring up, they will have more infantry through all these volunteer forces, through the fact, as I said, that they'll be able to recruit manpower in these particular regions. And that will, I think, over time, weigh the balance even more. I mean, I get the sense that if we look back at the situation, say in March, when the Donbass battle began, at that point, I think Ukraine had a very considerable advantage in infantry manpower. I suspect that's reduced over as a result of all of these losses. With these Russian reinforcements emerging, coming into play, that will reduce even further. So you'll see the sort of balance tilt. At least that's the way I think. But I don't think they're going to send conscripts in. I think that at a certain level also, I think that the Russian military anyway wants to move away from a concept of war in which war is fought by conscripts. I think conscripts are seen as creating a manpower reserve pool rather than as people that you send into the front lines in battle. So I don't personally think that we're going to see the conscripts hurled into battle anymore.
I agree. I just want to just double down on that. The Russians have already been transitioning away from conscripts. You take a look at their most recent levy, so to speak. I forget the number. I think the total number that they were looking at for the year was 260,000. Roughly half of those they're conscripted at every 6 months. There's 2 cycles, and the Russians stuck with it. There wasn't this massive expansion of recruitment. They basically recruited the number of conscripts they needed for a peacetime military obligation. It's the same level of recruitment that took place prior to the special military operation occurring. And as Alexander said, and this is something that came up in 2008 during their short little war with the Georgians. The Georgian infantry had been trained by the Marines. I'm not a big fan of NATO training either Georgia or Ukraine, but hey, Marines, they're professional and they train these troops very well. And the Russians, after the war was fought, they said, we have never seen light infantry operate this way. They were 10 times better than we were. Their fire, maneuver, their command and control, the way their troops cooperate with each other. They said these guys were fantastic. It's just that we were able to bring over tanks and artillery that infantry doesn't stand a chance against. But boy, could those Georgians fight. And and that's when the Russians went, well, if that's how the Georgians do it, what if we ever have to go up against the big dog? Okay, we just fought a Chihuahua. We won, but it bit us. What if we have to go up against that Rottweiler over there? How do we handle that one? And so they started changing. One of the things they did is, as you change the quality of your equipment, as you change the capability of your communications, as you change the tactics and the operation, the doctrine, you increase the level of military proficiency required to accomplish it, such that you can't accomplish it with a conscript military. One of the reasons why the Soviets had used mass to the way they did is that the concept of mass played well to their conscript military. They were able to conscript a large number of people, put them in on a large number of equipment that would do very simple tasks in a massive manner and overwhelm an enemy. That's not how the Russians fight now. They're very sophisticated. They require very professional troops that can think. Concept of commander's intent. This notion that the Russian soldier is just a silly little robot who was told to do something and executes it blindly. That's over. The Russian soldier is a thinking professional who is given a commander's intent and then comes up with the ways to accomplish that intent based upon the reality on the ground. This is a professional soldier. 70% of the Russian military consists of what they call contract soldiers, which basically are professional soldiers. And that number is going to increase. The goal of the Russians, I believe, is to bring down as close to zero the conscripts. And as Alexander said, one of the reasons why they don't have to do the draft is, first of all, when this war started, again, this is anecdotal, and I always hesitate to rely on anecdotal information. But my belief was that there was a significant anti-war feeling in Russia, that many, many, many Russians were not for this conflict. They didn't understand the necessity to attack a fellow Slavic country. There's huge familial roots, relationship. You scratch a Russian, you get a Ukrainian grandmother. You scratch a Ukrainian, you get a Russian uncle. I mean, that's just the way it is. And so there was a lot of resentment. The Russian government hadn't done a good job of explaining this conflict to its people. And so I think there was a problem there, which is one of the reasons why the Russian government hesitates to mobilize, because of mobilization in a population that's not ready to be mobilized could lead to disastrous consequences. But what's happened is, over time, the Russian people have figured it out themselves. As Alexander said, we don't get it in the West. They get it in Russia. They know exactly what's happening. They understand the hatred, the visceral hatred that Ukrainians feel towards Russians, calling them orcs. I mean, this is the most vile racism that you can imagine. And then you turn that hatred exists among the rank and file Ukrainian. I think many Russians were shocked about how much resentment existed in the rank and file Ukrainian. I'm not talking about the Nazis. I'm talking about the average Ukrainian, the resentment towards Moscow, the resentment towards the Russians. And then you add to that this Ukrainian nationalism, this vile concept of racial supremacy that treats Poles and Russians and Jews as subhumans. This isn't theoretical. We know they slaughtered hundreds of thousands of them at the end of World War II and the decade following World War II. So it's not hypothetical, it's real. This is Ukrainian, that's the true face of Ukrainian nationalism. And I think the Russians finally went, whoa, this is serious. We're buying into this war. Now there's two things about the buy-in. We're buying into this war, but then they turn to the government and say, and you better win, and win decisively. They're not buying into the war, they have a half measure. That's why when everybody starts talking about negotiation, I'm like, there ain't going to be a negotiation. There's going to be unconditional surrender, but there's not going to be a negotiation. There's not going to be terms. Ukrainians aren't coming to the table saying, we have fought you to a standstill, accept our terms. The Russians are going to just basically say, how much of your pathetic little country do you want to have left under your pathetic little rule? And we'll dictate to that. You get no vote. You get no say. What we decide is what you're going to get. And I think that one of the reasons the Russians have to take this hardline position is that the Russian population demands it, requires it, because of the sacrifices that have been made, because of what's happened emotionally to Russia to buy into this conflict. And that buy-in brings it with a surge of patriotism. Right now the United States Army is running into a recruiting problem. We can't motivate the fat, woke population of youngsters to volunteer for military service. People are just saying, we don't want to do it. Not only that, people don't, the nation can't even can't generate enough people to meet the basic minimum standards to be in the military anymore. Kids don't grow up wanting to be a soldier, wanting to be a Marine anymore. I mean, I grew up my dad was Air Force, but all I wanted to do is join the military. And I trained, I played sports with a line of joining a team, be physically fit. All of my peers were trying to be physically fit. And many of us wanted to join the military. That was what we wanted to do, to serve our country. The concept of national service isn't as widespread as it used to be. And I think Russia had fallen into that malaise. Not now. There's Russians that want to serve, and there are significant volunteers. And there's two kinds of troops fighting for the Russians. You have the professional troops, the paratroopers, the Marines, the guys from the armored units, and of course the infantry units. But then you also have what they call the Guard, the Russian Guard. It used to be the Ministry of Interior, the Interior Ministry forces, significant in numbers. They've been turned to what's called the Russian Guard. And the Russian Guard is generating new battalions, new levies of troops, all volunteers. The Chechens have a training academy that's punching out thousands of volunteers trained to very high standards who are organized into either replacement units or actual functioning units and sent. And this training is taking place, again, amongst the volunteer population out of the occupied territories. I don't know if that's a politically correct term to use, but the former Ukrainian territories of Kherson are generating a population significant enough to create the Odessa Brigade. There's a Kharkov Brigade being formed. And I think you're seeing the creation of these well-trained, motivated light infantry units, which are going to be called upon to do some very heavy fighting. When we come back to casualties. Let's say the Russians suffered 15,000 dead. That's my rough estimate. Of that, around 5,000, maybe 6,000 are regular Russian forces. The rest of them are the militia members of the Donetsk People's Militia and the Lugansk People's Militia. They're taking the brunt of the casualties because they're doing the brunt of the heavy fighting. And that's done deliberately because this is the liberation of Lugansk. This is the liberation of Donetsk, where the Russians are letting them take the lead in clearing trenches, et cetera. The Russians will support them if and when necessary. But I think when we start taking a look, for instance, the battle for Odessa, I think you'll see that the lead troops going into the clearing of Odessa will be the Odessa Brigade. They'll be supported by Russian Marines. They'll be supported by Russian paratroopers, by Chechen Spetsnaz or Chechen Special Forces. But the guys that are going to be doing the trench fighting, the trench clearing, are going to be the Odessa Brigade, and they're going to take the bulk of the casualties. The same thing when you go into Kharkov. It'll be the Kharkov Brigade. And that's the Russian intent. The people who have the vested interest in liberating a territory are going to be doing the fighting. The people liberating Donbass are the militias of the Donbass republics. Yeah. And they're taking the heavy casualties. And the people that will liberate, once Donbass is liberated and you make this move into these other territories, I think you're going to see people taking the lead in the fighting are going to be light infantry units that are recruited from these territories, supported by patriotic, motivated guard units. The Russian military, the professionals, are going to be there, but they're going to be playing more of a supporting role, or they'll concentrate their capability on points of strategic importance where you need that professionalism brought to bear. But they don't need to mobilize, and they don't want to mobilize. If Russia mobilizes, and I'll leave it with this, when Israel fought Hezbollah in 2006, if you take a look at the statistics, Hezbollah lost. They lost more men. They lost more equipment. Hezbollah won that war hands down. Why? They won the war by not losing. They won the war by not losing. The Israeli victory wasn't a victory at all. It was sort of embarrassing. It was a humiliation. And even though the Israeli army wasn't defeated because it didn't win, it lost. A mobilization by Russia is a defeat. It's a strategic defeat. So Russia's not going to mobilize because that means they lost. Anything that gives the Ukrainians a sense that they have compelled the Russians to shift away strategically from their master plan is a victory for Ukraine. And it's something that the Ukrainians can build upon and get international support for. So a Russian mobilization would be a defeat for Russia, a victory for Ukraine. And I don't think the Russians are going to be mobilizing anytime soon. They don't need to. They don't want to. And again, if they do it, it's a political defeat for them.
Yeah, I wouldn't expect them to send the conscript to the front line. That would be, it would be very unpopular to have, of course, these people coming home in coffins. That would reduce a lot of support for the war. I was more thinking for the people in the back, the territories which have already been taken, which are now, so we can send the professional soldiers more to the front line and have, of course, improve the rotation and ensure they get enough relaxation between the advances. But I think this problem with, one of the biggest mistakes the West did was exactly going essentially to war with all the Russians, because I agree with what Scott has said. This is a lot of Russians felt really bad about, very uncertain about this war when it began in February. They were very much split. Not many people were comfortable going to war with, again, a fellow Slavic country, Ukraine and all. However, I guess the best way to get them all, for the Kremlin to get everyone over to their side, was, when the Americans came out and said, like, well, our objective in this war is not just defend Ukraine, we're going to permanently weaken Russia. We're going make sure they can never launch an offensive, go to war again. I mean, this kind of was an open declaration of war, which suggested, even if you still in Russia you're opposed to the war, if you're fighting for your own survival, it's not only about this war. Now you see it as essentially what the Kremlin has said. This is a proxy wars. The United States coming after Russia. This is what they were doing in Ukraine. And I think this kind of has sunk in for many Russians. And so again, I think the main, Washington made a huge mistake on this, but not just the United States, the Europeans as well. Me and Alexander were talking earlier before, about the way Russians are treated now. There's always been a very strong Russophobia in Europe, well, for centuries, but we always had this kind of liberal veil. We pretended that we really loved Russians. We just hate their leaders. But now with this conflict, it's just the mood has changed. It's no one's pretending anymore. It's quite vile. Like, we don't want any Russians in the Olympics. We don't want to see Russians tennis courts. We don't play chess with them. They're not allowed to come to our countries as tourists. Essentially, the Russians are our enemy. Like, this is the language now. So I think, this, even Arstovich in Ukraine recognized that, listen, maybe there would be some friendly pro-Ukrainians in Belarus or Russia, but frightening everyone away. This is Arstovich of all people. So it's, I think this has been for the Pentagon, or at least this has been a huge mistake, though.
It has been a disastrous mistake. Yeah, I was just saying, it has been an absolutely disastrous mistake, and one, by the way, which I feel that we've made it bigger in Europe than has been done in the United States, actually. I have to say this: if you wanted to do something at the start of this war that was guaranteed to consolidate Russian support behind the Russian government, then all the things that were done in the first few weeks work in the West, especially in Europe, by the European Union, by European governments, were calculated to that objective. I mean, the single thing which I happen to know crystallized the feelings of many of the people in Russia that I know was the sort of global flight ban. The idea that Russians were no longer going to be able to fly into Europe in the way that they could, the attempt to sort of shut out Aeroflot. This gave the huge impression Russians are not wanted in Europe. And Russia was a far more sophisticated society that I think many people in the West understand. Russians are far better informed than many people in the West understand. They're much better educated. They saw all of this. They saw Western leaders the way they were talking about Russia. They saw all these things about, banning Tchaikovsky and throwing Dostoevsky off courses, which is true, by the way. Things like that actually happened. They are familiar with the kind of things the media in the West has been pumping out. And they said to themselves, Putin's given this rambling, incoherent speech at the beginning of this war. But he's right. He's absolutely right. These people are fundamentally antagonistic, not just to him, but to us. And therefore, this is an existential issue. And we saw this extraordinary consolidation of Russian society, which has taken place. And something else has happened, which is, of course, the West, at least especially the Europeans again, I think also here the United States, seriously underestimated the sophistication of the Russian economy. I think they really talked themselves into this belief that it really is a gas station masquerading as a country, that it really doesn't have, the abilities to run things, that it wouldn't be able to put things together. And I think they really did believe, you'd impose these sanctions, people in Russia, they wouldn't be able to come and shop in Harrods, and the oligarchs would be angry with Putin, the economy would crash, there'd be hyperinflation, and the whole political system in Moscow would collapse like a house of cards. And in fact, on the contrary, all the steps they took achieved the opposite effect. to the one that they intended. They ended up consolidating Russian society behind Putin, and this is something I know, Glenn, that you've been writing extensively about, confirming in Russia the Eurasian choice. You've had this tension, historic tension in Russia between West, people who lean towards the West, say Russia should really integrate itself fully with the West, and others who say, well, we're somewhat, we have different geographical position. We need to perhaps think about things more broadly. There's been the people who've been talking about the greater Eurasia project. There's been all of those things. Well, this has decisively and conclusively within Russia itself settled those arguments. There's been this decision, and I think this is widely supported across Russian society, to pivot eastward, except that for the moment, a relationship with the West is simply impossible. Build up your economy, build up Russian society as best you can. And then eventually, when you do finally settle with Europe, which you will at some point inevitably, do so from a position not of negotiation and discussion, but from a position of much greater strength and much greater authority than the one we've had up to now. And this isn't just, policymakers in Moscow who are now talking in this way. I've started to see people who are, Russians I know, people who are not political in that kind of sense. They're starting to talk in this way, which they have never done up to now.
Look, there's the old saying, Alexander and Glenn, I'm sure you're familiar with this. Democracies don't fight democracies. Yeah. And that's not because they each vote. It's because democracies tend to be focused on the economic as opposed to the military. And so a democracy with a neighboring democracy will have this deep economic ties that make it impractical to fight them. You don't want to fight them because they're an extension of you. You're interwoven into them. They're interwoven into you. One of the fatal mistakes made by the West is not recognizing the reality of Putin's weaknesses. I mean, we all talk about Putin's strengths right now, and Putin's stronger today. And I'm sorry, I apologize. Russia's stronger. I don't want to personify a nation of 130, 140 million people into one person the way it's always done here in the West. But Russia is a nation that's led by a leader named Vladimir Putin. He's a president. He is elected. And I know that there's not a strong, vibrant Russian opposition. Whatever Russian opposition has tried to exist has been corrupted by the money of Western intelligence that seeks to undermine Russian democracy by infiltrating it with people of the likes of Navalny and others. But Putin can still lose an election. let's not forget that reality. But at the end of the day, if enough Russians go to the poll and they vote against Vladimir Putin, he will not be president. This is not an absolute dictatorship. And Putin knows this, and his political party knows this. And one of the big weaknesses that existed in Russia was the economic interdependence that existed between Russia and the West. And this interdependence can be seen in two ways. We'll say three. One has two subsets. One is the oligarchs. People, they took a tremendous amount of Russian wealth, took it out of Russia, and then leveraged that wealth to create this bridging effect between the Russian economy and the Western economy. And they had a lot of influence, a lot of it. Putin didn't like this influence. I mean, Putin has always railed against the oligarchs, but they were there, and that much money made them too big to fail. You couldn't afford to shut them down because the shock on the Russian economy would be so great that politically Putin couldn't survive. So if Putin sought to eradicate the oligarch class, I think the political ramifications would have been felt at the polls. The other one is the day-to-day working class. Putin wins elections, 54, 64% level. I mean, true dictators win about, 99%. So he's not a true dictator. There's an element of democracy here. There's a 30-40% of the Russians that say maybe we don't like Putin as much as everybody thinks we did. And of that 30, but then there's this percentage that is apolitical. They vote for Putin, not because they like Putin, but because he maintains the status quo ante of economic interrelationships with the West that is their livelihood. It allows them to feed their families, put clothes on their kids, put a roof over their house, and that's what they've invested in. They haven't invested in the great pivot to the East. They're invested in an economic relationship with London, with Paris, with New York. And if Putin did what he knows he needed to do in order to make Russia strong, that is to have the strategic divorce with the West, that percentage, 20, 30%, whatever, would pivot against him in the polls. He would be voted out of office. So Putin's weakness was the oligarch class and this middle class that was integrated with the West. If I were a strategist in the White House, I would say we need to develop a gradual system of targeted sanctions that solely focus on turning the oligarchs and this middle class against Putin over the Ukrainian conflict. That there's already at the start, there's a big number of Russians that aren't happy about this conflict. And if we gradually tweak the sanctions to make life inconvenient, not horrible, inconvenient, then people will say, I don't like being inconvenienced by this war. And there could have been the kind of resounding rejection of Putin's war. That's how it would have been thought if you sold it properly in the West to a Russian population that might be inclined to accept that because their life is inconvenient. That's not what we did. We did Putin the biggest favor on earth, shock therapy. See, Putin couldn't do the grand divorce. We did it for him. We made it so easy for him. We said, boom, there will be no economic relations with the West. And the Russian middle class went, what the hell? And yeah, initially they might have said, we blame you, Vladimir Putin. But then they had to turn around and say, but our friends in the West can't. There's not even a helping hand. There's no sympathy. Wait, weren't these sanctions supposed to be against him, but you're attacking me? You're taking away my ability to feed my family, my ability to put a roof over my house. You've attacked me. I thought we were friends. The West was never your friend, Russia. That's a big wake-up call. And then the oligarchs. How much economic pressure can you put on Vladimir Putin when the West takes all your money and you've got no more leverage? The only thing they had was their wealth that they could come in and parse out here and there and never. We took it all. And Putin, when that happened, he said, thank you. You remember the speech, Alexander? I can't quote it, but he basically said, get the hell out. You wanted to live in Europe? Live in Europe. Don't come home. You're not welcome here. The West did Vladimir Putin the biggest favor in the world because we made the pivot east politically possible in a short period of time. We empowered him to do this. We made it certain that he would get no resistance in Russia because we never gave the Russians an alternative. There's many Russians that maybe didn't want to pivot east. Maybe they liked their iPhones. They don't want to get the Huawei cell phone. Maybe they, but the irritation of these Russians is very superficial. It deals with brand names and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, the pivot is putting food on the table, roof over their head, clothes on the backs of their children, and they have an economic future, and it's no longer tied to a West that was never the friend of Russia to begin with. We just used Russia for our economic benefit. And when push came to shove, when it was time for us to stand up and say, hey, we don't want to hurt the Russian people. We're against the war in Ukraine, but we don't want to hurt the Russian people. We didn't say that. What we said is, stop the war in Ukraine. We have to devastate the Russian people. We have to gut the Russian people. We have to crush the Russian people. And that's one of the biggest lessons that I think the people of Russia have learned, that the West is unworthy of Russia. Therefore, Russia will never again try to make amends. The outreach to the West that began with Peter the Great, the window on the West and all that, it's over. That door's shut. That doesn't mean that there's going to be a giant wall. This isn't Game of Thrones with the giant ice wall separating the Northlings from the. No, there will be relations. Eventually, the West and Russia once again learn to peacefully coexist, but it will never again be as a partner or friends. I think it'll be just as people who are compelled by history to live next to each other. So let's find a way to do so peacefully. But the notion of a great Russian friendship with the West, I think that's over for a long time. Russia has made a pivot to Eurasia. They're committing to that. Their economy is getting focused on that. And the future of Russia is going to be defined by that. And that's solely on the West. The West, this is one of the greatest mistakes the West has made huge military mistakes, which we already talked about. But the economic mistake and the political mistake that's attached to that is of greater importance because this war is going to end. But what we've done is guarantee that if it takes place after the war, we're not going to be in control of it. And look at how it diminishes us. Look how divorcing Russia diminished the West. Look how diminished Europe is today. Look how diminished the United States is becoming. The G7 used to be the model of economic strength, the 7 most powerful industrial nations in the world. Today, the G7 is a joke when compared to, for instance, BRICS. People talk about, well, then we'll go to the G20, subtract the G7 for the G20, and what do you get? Oh, BRICS. And who's in control of BRICS? Not the United States, Russia, China. So this economic victory has been total on the part of Russia. And Alexander, again, the disrespect we had for Russia, and I've had this struggle with professional colleagues who focus on energy, the absolute disdain they had for Russia, for the Russian political system, for the Russian economy. Everybody believed that Russia wouldn't survive these sanctions, that the Russian energy market wasn't sophisticated. Come on, man. The Russians have proven to be far more sophisticated than just about anybody in the world. And the ultimate expression of sophistication is when Biden went to Saudi Arabia last month, crawling on his knees to make, buddy with MBS. Man, he called a pariah. I will never deal with this man. We will socially isolate him. Now, because you need Saudi Arabia to increase oil production, you went crawling to him. Debasing yourself, debasing your country, debasing anything you stood for, and you got nothing. Because what did Saudi Arabia tell them? We may increase a little bit, but no, that decision is not going to be made now between you and me. That decision is going to be made in August when OPEC Plus gets together. What's the plus? Russia. So guess who got to make the final decision on how much oil was going to be increased to alleviate the economic harm on Russia? That gas station. But that gas station turned out to be a far more sophisticated global businessman than anybody ever gave him credit for.
Indeed. Can I just add to that, Scott? The Russians themselves, I think, have been astonished by their own success. Even Putin has. And I'm guessing because I don't know what Putin himself is thinking. But I think one of the other things that's happened as a result of the sanctions, well, all that you said, I agree with, by the way, completely agree with, about the fact that, inconveniencing the people would have been much more effective. But one of the other things that held Russia to the West, or rather prevented the break, was this fact that Russians, especially since the late Soviet period, have had this enormous sense of, well, we're not as good as the West. We know we can't really do things as well as the West. If the rest really comes down hard against us, well, everything will fall apart. Everything will break down, as it did in the late 80s and early 90s, and as it did again in 1998, and as it almost did in 2008. We've got to find always ways of being on good terms, especially with the Americans, because that's the only real game in town, and we can't trust ourselves. And now look what happens. We impose all those sanctions. We do the absolute extreme of sanctions, and to the Russians' own astonishment, their economy continues to function. The meat is still on the table. The roof is still over the house. The electricity is still running. The gas is still there. The shops are still full. The prices are actually falling at the moment. So this has been revelatory. And of course, you put that all together, success in war, success in economics, you're going to see a very big change in Russia. There's going to be a huge surge in Russian self-confidence of a sort that you haven't seen since the 1960s. I mean, Russia lost its belief in itself a long time ago, actually. But as I said, it's going to start regaining it in a way that we've not seen in the West for a very, very long time.
Let me just add to that real quick. And I agree with you 100%. It's like Russia found their mojo. What was the movie Austin Power? They got their mojo back, baby. And it's real. I mean, you're right. I'm going to say things. I hope I don't insult anybody in Russia, but there was always a sense of Russian national pride, of Russian accomplishment. But at the end of the day, there was a sense of Russian inferiority, that Russia just wasn't as good as the West, that Russia needed the West to be like a big brother to it. And you're 100% right. I don't think there's anybody right now looking to the West. In fact, what's happened now is that the wool has been pulled off the eyes and people are looking to the West with a greater clarity than they ever had. I mean, everybody always knew that the West had racist problems, that we had, economic inequalities, there's homeless in America, et cetera. But that was always pushed aside in a similar way that the American people have pushed that aside on the premise of, yes, but America is the greatest power in the world. We're the shining city on the hill. We can do everything better than anybody. It turns out that maybe we can't. And maybe the Russians are learning that they not only are they good, they're really good. They're capable. In many cases, they're better than the West is. So I think this notion of Russian inferiority has been swept away. And but here's the thing, because this could be very dangerous. It could be a very dangerous moment in world history if Russia was programmed the way the United States was. If this was Cold War era zero-sum game where every loss for you is a victory for me, therefore I'm going to magnify your losses, maximize my victories. The world could be in for a very bad period of time. Fortunately for the world, the Russian leadership is far much more mature and sophisticated than any leadership in the West. I mean, you can't call any of the European nations sophisticated or mature based upon their performance vis-a-vis Russia in the sanctions and in this military. The military says these are the actions of irrational children. The Russians, on the other hand, have a very mature leadership, a very focused leadership, and they're focused on the concept of multilateralism. And this isn't just, they're not just using that word to throw out there for political points. They mean it. They believe it. Mm-hmm. And the Russian foreign ministry, just take a look at Sergei Lavrov, a man who I just, I don't want to fall into fan club type, adoration, but hey, hats off to this guy. He's pretty darn good as a foreign minister. He's smart. I just wish that he was 20 years younger because the world could use Sergei Lavrov being in a position to influence things going down the road. He's getting older. Hopefully the Russians are raising the next generation of Sergei Lavrovs. Mm-hmm. But this man went to Africa, carried out dueling diplomacy with Tony Blinken, and dominated. I mean, the way Russia came off after this visit was of a nation that truly wanted to be friends, to work with people in a collaborative fashion to get through whatever problems faced them. Tony Blinken came in, and he was accompanied in a parallel trip by the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Linda Thomas Greenfield, I think her name is. She arrived in Uganda after Lavrov left Uganda. When Lavrov was in Uganda shaking hands, making buddy-buddy with the Ugandan president, the U.S. ambassador went there and said, hey, you guys can buy Russian food. You can buy Russian fertilizer if you want to. But if you buy Russian energy, if you buy things that are sanctioned, there will be repercussions to you. And the Africans are going, you can't talk to us like that anymore. And you know who said that? The South African foreign minister, saying what Tony Blinken said, I will not sit here and allow you to bully us. Now, you, Tony, you haven't done it, but your ambassador did. Bullied all of Africa. And all of Europe comes here thinking they're doing your bidding by bullying us. We're not going to be bullied anymore. And Russia is exploiting this growing split in this world, this growing irritation in the world of, the world is ready for American-led hegemony to finish. and they're ready to enter a multilateral world, and they're trusting Russia. So I think we're seeing, and this is something that American geopolitical analysts are missing, that we're looking at a period of time where opportunity is being matched by capability and, more importantly, intent. The opportunity for multilateralism is being matched by a resurgent Russia that is capable of helping lead this effort with full intent on doing it honestly. Russia isn't playing any rules-based international order games. Russia's playing the law-based international order game. So is China. And I think we're going to see the world rally around Russia and China leadership, not to replace America, because that would be wrong. That would just be taking that a bad system run by Americans and turn it into a bad system run by Chinese and Russians, but to use the Russians and the Chinese to empower everybody to rise up. Now, it's not going to be a bed of roses. It's not going to be perfect. There will be conflict. That's just human nature. But I think we're looking at one of these great moments in history where one system is being replaced by another, and Russia is going to take a lead because they've empowered themselves. Russia believes in themselves. I don't think Russia could have done this 10 years ago. No. I don't think Russia could have gone on the world stage with the confidence necessary to lead the world against the United States. But right now, they have the confidence, they have the intent, they have the capability, and they have, more importantly, a world ready to receive their leadership, because the world is just fed up. I mean, what the South African foreign minister said to Tony Blinken, I think is going to be repeated over and over and over again by the rest of the world. You no longer have the right to lecture us.
I think
you don't have the right to lecture us.
I think that's a key indication of the difficulty the United States has to adjust now, because in the unipolar order, it was possible to do this thing. You know, you pressure, you bully, you put sanctions on someone until they bend over and do as they're told. But in the multipolar order, it's somewhat different, because again, with the sanctions, you're just handing over markets to others, and also with this pressure and bullying, as you pointed out, Africans can simply say, well, we'll just go to the Chinese or the Russians, or someone who doesn't pose ultimatums to us. And I think that's also why this sanctions against Russia has been such a huge folly, because it shows we haven't appreciated, as Scott pointed out, well, what this interdependence how it has benefited us. Because again, countries often use this asymmetrical economic interdependence for its own advantage. But Russia's always been more dependent on the West than the West has been on Russia. So we've been obsessing for 30 years about having too much dependence on Russian energy, but they've been using our banks, our currency, our transportation corridors, our technologies, our industries, the whole thing. And now suddenly, with these sanctions, it's all being cut. And not only Russians, but by seizing all the funds of the Russian central bank, cutting off key technology supplies. And now, of course, you have former NATO General Secretary saying, "Oh, we can maybe close off the Barents, the Baltic Sea for the Russians now that we have Finland and Sweden, so we're going to cut off their supply lines." I mean, it's not just the Russians who are now thinking we will not rely anymore on their industries, their technologies, transportation corridors, or any financial instruments, but the rest of the world's noticing as well. They kind of horrified that, I keep making this point that often in the West, we see this as a sign of virtue, all these sanctions, yes. But the rest of the world, they started to see us as somewhat rogue, because all these rules we previously had, not seizing funds of central banks and threatening blockades on Kaliningrad, all the rules seem to have been broken, and the trust is gone. And at the same time, maybe Russia's not the great economic replacement of the United States, but behind it you have China. So I think all these sanctions, if it had any purpose, it could be justified. But these markets are gone for good. And again, we keep suggesting that we've been doing Russia some favors for the past 30 years by including it. But really, the trade we've had with Russia means, they've been exporting cheap gas, oil, metals, keeping all our industries, competitive, and we can sell all our, manufactured goods, technologies back to the Russians. This huge market, it's all over. All the cheap energy metals now going to Asia, and the huge market to sell to is all gone as well. They're not going to trust any supply chains with the West anymore, just like the Chinese are not doing it. So it's just this is a permanent divorce, and it's going to undermine. It has undermined our competitiveness. There was this funny example this week with Slovakia. I'm not sure if you read it. Because of they don't want to buy any more Russian gas, so energy prices have gone so high up that they can't afford make their own aluminium anymore. So now they have to import aluminium from Russia. You can't make it up. This is it's like a horrible circle of sanctions. It's just there's no strategic thinking. I feel it's just this emotional. We're angry. This feels good, virtuous, but it's It just again, I don't see any purpose behind this. There's no plan of. There's no one behind the wheel. It's quite shocking to see all these things play out.
It is absolutely shocking. Can I just say? I mean, well, I can remember the United States. I mean, I should say my background. I was somebody who had an enormous admiration for the United States. I still do. I absolutely do. I have an enormous sentimental attachment to the United States, to the American Constitution, to the American political system, as I imagine it to be to American culture. And I can remember the old United States, an enormous organizational, industrial power. They understood these things. They understood all of the interconnections. They wouldn't have made these mistakes 50 years ago, 60, 70 years ago. They would not have done this because, as it's turned out, we assumed that the Russians were dependent on us economically and never considered the extent to which we have become dependent on them. We assumed that Russians can't do without our high technology. And we didn't realize that we need their gas, their wheat, their chemical fertilizer, their oil, their coal, their aluminium, their rare earths, that in fact, they have become completely embedded in our economic system. And of course, the great problem is that if you're talking about high technology and that sort of thing, the effects of a high technology restrictions are long-term, whereas the effects of cutting yourself off from vital raw materials and commodities are immediate. And the Russians have a great deal of science, a great deal of organization. They can probably, to a great extent, mitigate whatever technological cutoffs we impose on them. And of course, there's another world now beyond Europe, beyond the United States. The days when technology and science was a Western thing and nobody else did it are gone, and that's something else we haven't understood. But they can probably work it out over time, and they have the time and the space in Russia to do it. They can build aircraft, they can build cars, country that launches rockets, sends things into space. They can do a lot of things themselves, which we pretend to ourselves they can't do. They can do it, and they can find others who will help them. They will find people in China, they can find people in Korea, they can find people in Malaysia, in Singapore, in all sorts of places. But as it turns out, we can't just replace oil, gas, coal, food, all of these things, because you can't do that, and you need that immediately. And that's why we are in this very difficult economic place at the moment. That's why if you go to these two capitals, I live in London, I have friends in Moscow. You look at these two capitals, prices are rising in London all the time. Food products are getting more expensive. Energy products are getting more expensive. The cost of living is rising. As I am speaking to you, the entire London underground system, the metro, the subway is closed because the workers have gone on strike because they can't make ends meet. We have problems replicating themselves right across, cascading through the British economy, through the German economy, whereas in Russia, food prices are falling, energy costs are falling because they have in abundance those things which are essential and which we don't. We never understood, and to be frank, I didn't understand myself the extent to which the prosperities that we achieved in the West since the 1980s, the reduction in inflation that we achieved since the 1980s was dependent upon this enormous release of Russian natural resources, commodities that became available after the Cold War, and which, in an extraordinary fit of madness, we have now denied ourselves. So we've not only managed to do all the other things that Scott was saying, but we've actually managed to deal an enormous amount of economic damage. And as you correctly say, Glenn, if all these things remain in place, it's going to become structural. Because yes, economies adjust. We will find alternatives to Russian gas. We will build more liquefied natural gas stations. We'll import it from Qatar or from the United States or from wherever. But it will be much more expensive than the gas we used to get from Russia, the pipeline gas, because the nature of the system makes it so. Pipeline gas is always going to be inherently cheaper, for example, than LNG. If we're denying ourselves access to, say, sunflower oil from Russia, yes, we can find it from somewhere else, but it'll have to come further. It will have to come by ship instead of being transported, more quickly from Russia. We're going to have all of those problems, and they are going to become cumulative, and they are going to become permanent. Now, at a time already when we are facing major economic and commercial and industrial challenges from Asian competitors, this is very, very bad for us. Now, it's especially bad in Europe because, of course, in Europe, we are resource poor. The United States remains very resource rich. It's largely self-sufficient. It can get through this. But in Europe, we have done ourselves immense and permanent damage. And I agree completely with your point, Glenn. Why would the Russians from this point on want to sell us gas? I mean, all those pipelines that were built, from a Russian point of view, they've come with nothing but problems. We've have abused them. We've harassed their company, Gazprom. We brought legal claims against it. We've had articles after articles about it. We've pressured them on price. We've done one thing or another. Trust is an essential part of a commercial relationship. And that's gone. Even if we said to the Russians, well, these sanctions were a hideous mistake, let's reverse them, it will not be a return to the status quo ante, because the Russians don't trust us anymore. They'll build their pipelines to Asia. They'll develop their links there, to sell their oil to India and China. They'll develop the economic linkages with Asia, and it'll be very, very bad news permanently for us in Europe. I don't think we've understood that. And by the way, and this is just a little thing at the end, I was talking about the industrial nature of warfare and the logistics, which has astonished me, by the way. But given that we've depleted our industrial and manufacturing bases in the West, look where manufacturing is now. Overwhelmingly, it's in Asia. To an extraordinary degree, it's in China. If the Russians can pour out ammunition so that they can fire 70,000 rounds of shells a day, day after day, week after week, what can the Chinese do, whose industrial base is multiples bigger than anything that Russia has? And I think that's something we need to start thinking about too.
So to summarize, Russia is winning the war. The economic sanctions have backfired horribly. We're not able to mobilize the rest of the world against Russia. Actually, we can't get anyone on board. And despite all of this, there's no talks. There's no, negotiations have become a naughty word. And diplomacy is nowhere to be found. And this is this is surprising, because you would think in a situation like this, we could put something on the table, like, okay, we're gonna what Russia asked for 30 years, like no more NATO expansionism. If we could use that in negotiations in Ukraine or anything, just but nothing on the table. Even if it's not going anywhere. Now we're not even sitting down and talking. This is, for me, this just seems like the lowest of the low in statecraft. It's hard to believe we're here, actually.
Yeah, look, this is the perennial problem, and I've said this in this discussion we've had, and I've said it in others. Someday this war is going to end. I mean, that's just inevitable. This war isn't going on forever. It's going to be over, whether it's going to be a matter of months, or a small number of months or a big number of months. It's going to end, and the mature nation, the sophisticated nation, the responsible nation needs to be looking for the diplomatic off-ramp away from conflict. I think that if there was this sense of maturity in Europe, you would have people telling their bosses, hey, we've lost in Ukraine. We've lost Ukraine. We're not going to win Ukraine. And if we continue to go all in on Ukraine, we're not going to have anything available as chips on the table for the post-conflict negotiation that's going to have to take place. Remember, what preceded this war was Russia's demands for a new European security framework. Now, Russia put forward 2 draft treaties that the West rejected. When the Russians put them forward in December of last year, a lot of people said, oh, the audacity of Russia. How dare they think they could dictate these terms to the West? Russia wasn't dictating terms. Russia was just stating the fact. This is the way it's going to have to be. Russia's hand has become demonstrably stronger by their victory over Ukraine. And any responsible, mature, adequate geopolitical strategist or analyst would recognize that if we don't seek to become a player in defining this off-ramp, Russia will be increasingly empowered to dictate the terms of the post-war relationship in a manner which is almost will favor Russia across the board. And that's a very dangerous situation, because no matter what, at the end of the day, NATO is still a nuclear enterprise. And that a military conflict between Russia and NATO will bring into the equation nuclear weapons. And, desperate people do desperate things, and NATO is becoming an increasingly desperate organization. So in order to diminish this desperation, it would be very responsible of NATO at this point in time to seek to mitigate the harm that's being done to Ukraine by trying to terminate this war sooner rather than later, preserving as much of Ukraine as you can, not because you want to use it against Russia, but because you owe that to the Ukrainian people. My God, we're sitting here, all this, we support Ukraine. We don't support Ukraine. We're destroying Ukraine. We're gutting Ukraine. We're devastating Ukraine. We must hate Ukraine, what we're doing. If I were Ukrainian, I'd realize you have been betrayed by the West. Seeking to join NATO was a suicide pill, a one-way mission. You should never have done it. But now that they've done it, it's incumbent upon the West to say, okay, we made a mistake. Let's mitigate the harm. But now, what needs to happen? There has to be a discussion about nuclear disarmament in Europe. The Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which the United States precipitously withdrew under false pretense, by the way, creating a Russian missile in violation that was not in violation, even when the Russians put it out there and said, hey, look, I'm just a simple Marine, but I've done enough missile inspections to know that when I look at a missile and the booster is the same and the booster is the same, that means it's the same amount of propellant. And when you look at the guidance section and a warhead that's a little bit bigger, the missile with the bigger guidance section warhead ain't going to go further than the missile with the same booster system, smaller guidance. And yet we're trying to pretend that this new missile the Russians built is going to go further than the one they did. No, it's absurd. We were the ones violating the INF Treaty by putting in place Aegis Ashore systems in Poland and Romania, the Mark 41, that could be with a flick of a switch transition from firing missile interceptor rockets to firing ground-launched cruise missiles. We said, oh, we would never do that. 1 month after we left the treaty, we tested that very system. Okay, now we're talking about deploying a new missile called Dark Eagle, a hypervelocity missile. We've activated a Cold War artillery brigade to receive it. This has to end now. And Europe needs to take control of their security and begin pressuring the United States to re-enter in a serious fashion negotiations with Russia about the resumption of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, even if China isn't part of those negotiations. This is about European security. It's not about America's relationship with China. Europe needs to take control of this. Europe also needs to put pressure on the United States to bring back the anti-ballistic missile treaty, to get rid of this notion, this stupidity of the ability to shoot down missiles, to create a missile shield. It doesn't work. And, Israel's Iron Dome works against crude Hamas rockets, bottle rockets being fired out of Hamas. Hezbollah will cut through Iron Dome like a hot knife through butter. Iran would eviscerate it. It's a false sense of security. You can't replicate that strategically, so why even try? Get rid of the anti-ballistic missile system, and in doing so, you now liberate yourself for greater strategic arms reduction to stop this mad rush towards modernization of the most horrible weapons on the planet. Russia has already gone through a round of modernization. They have the Sarmat missile, they have the Avant-Garde, they have others. The United States is talking about, putting in the Sentinel missile, the B-21 Raider bomber, the Columbia-class submarine. Stop spending trillions of dollars on nuclear disarmament of building weapons that logically you can never use, because the moment you use them, the world ends. And then finally, once you begin the process of reducing the nuclear threat, Europe would be very wise. And this is, I probably should, if I were a negotiator for the US government, I wouldn't articulate this loudly. But here's the bottom line. Russia is going to emerge from this Ukrainian conflict with military superiority over the West, just like the West had superiority over Russia at the end of the Cold War. What is needed in Europe today more than ever is a new conventional forces in Europe treaty, one that creates exactly what Russia has been asking for, a buffer of stability separating NATO from Russia. That doesn't mean that NATO is dismantled. It just means that NATO infrastructure is pulled back to its 1997 lines. And if you put it in the context of a treaty, then this wonderful, huge, powerful Russian military that they've accumulated in Ukraine needs to be pulled back to an equivalent distance. You need inspectors to come in, monitoring to take place. You need to de-emphasize the military in Russian-European relations. This is the off-ramp that is absolutely necessary if you're going to preserve peace and stability. And it's the only way that Europe's going to be able to catch the breath it needs to recover economically. Do you really think the Germans are going to be able to come up with 100 billion euros that Schultz says he's going to allocate to rebuild the German army? No, the German economy is collapsing. Do you think Europe is really going to build this 300,000 rapid response force that Stoltenberg says is the future? Not even close. They're collapsing. Europe can't afford this. And if Europe continues to engage in open economic and quasi-military conflict with Russia, it's just going to collapse even further. Arms control is the way of the future. Europe could dictate an outcome that is better for Europe, not perfect, but better for Europe, by being prepared to work with the Russians on this front. And it will do, and you talked about it, Alexander, it will go a long way to creating the possibility of the resurrection of a sense of trust between nations. Right now, there is no trust between nations, but we have to do that, because otherwise, Russia's going to finish this war, and then Russia's going to impose its will on the West. We're talking about a Europe that is fundamentally broken. Europe will not be able to rise to the challenge, and the United States will be dealing with its own implosion that's taking place right now, economically and politically. The United States is a very sick nation right now. And it will become even more sick if we're forced to deal with a collapsed Europe and a resurgent Russia, and a China, by the way, that's also growing by leaps and bounds. So inject stability by acting stable. Arms control is the future.
Yeah, Scott, what you're saying is absolutely right. And can I just say, this is what Sir Glenn was talking about, the collapse of statecraft. And the tragedy is, who invented diplomacy? Where does the expression diplomacy come from? All the language of diplomacy, ambassadors, all that, embassies, all this, it's European. It was the Europeans who invented modern diplomacy. Are they doing any? Of course, they're doing nothing. They're doing absolutely nothing. And, all the three of us can remember the peace movements which existed in Europe, which were enormously useful and important parts of the European political landscape. Where are they? What's happened? Who worries about nuclear war anymore? Who worries about nuclear weapons anymore? You talk about the Dark Eagle. I've heard of the Dark Eagle. Glenn, the three of us, do people in the streets in Europe even know about this system that's going to be brought into the heart of Europe? We have got to rediscover some kind of political ability in Europe, because otherwise we're drifting into confrontations which are just doing us enormous damage. Now, how that's going to be done, given the desert which is the political landscape in Europe at the moment, I can't say. I just don't know. But all I will say is this: I've never known a period in history when European leadership has been as poor and as bankrupt and as morally incompetent as the one we're going through today. And I think of the opportunities that existed 30 years ago when the Cold War ended, and the way in which those have been thrown away to a great extent by the United States, but by Europe also. And if I think about it too much, it makes me very bitter.
On that yes, sad note, sure.
Well, I mean, what I will say is this: let's all just end there. I mean, it's astonishing. There's that wonderful expression, which, by the way, historically is true, that the times bring forth the man or the woman. It may very well be that this is the crisis that Europe needs. I mean, we might need this crisis to shake ourselves out of this complacency that we've been, this cocoon of complacency and arrogance and stupidity which we built up around ourselves. When people, I mean, as I said, we talk about their strikes and things like that. I mean, we've seen a revival of unionism, for example, in Britain, which, I mean, unions were dead here, but suddenly they're coming back into life. And it could very well be that as a result of this crisis, political forces will re-emerge in Europe, which will pull things back and turn things around. The potential to do it is there. But the leadership today is awful. It is terrible. I mean, if the best we can do is Emmanuel Macron, and he's the only person who sometimes says things, I mean, really.
There's an American philosopher, George Santayana, and he's been quoted over and over again. Those who fail to learn the lessons of history are condemned to repeat it. And the notion there is that history is composed of successive examples of failure. But there are these bright moments in history where successes occur. And one of the great successes was the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty that was signed in 1987, implemented in 1988, that reversed a course of an arms race that was going to destroy Europe and the world with it. On the American side, the man that made it possible was an actor, a guy who was reviled by the political elite of the Democratic Party. Even the Republicans viewed him as sort of an outsider, this quasi-conservative film screen star, simple man who did the worst of American politics, grossly oversimplifying the Soviet problem, the evil empire, et cetera, et cetera. and he led us out of the abyss. He led us out of the darkness. He signed a treaty that nobody thought could ever be signed, beginning a process of improving relations. Unfortunately, it was a very narrow window, and George Herbert Walker Bush wasn't up to the task of completing the assignment. It came late in Reagan's term, but from the most unlikely source, a leader emerged that led us out of this darkness. And when we think about the 1980s, as bad as things are right now, people tend to forget that in the 1980s, the United States was involved in a proxy war in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union, where we were pouring in millions of dollars for the sole purpose of killing Soviet soldiers. Sort of reminds me of what's going on in Ukraine right now. People forget that we were involved in sanctioning Russian gas, putting pressure on Europe to stop buying Russian gas, and we were singling out Russian energy and trying to isolate Russian energy. We even put in a device that gave an artificial measurement of the pressure, creating an explosion. We physically destroyed Russian energy infrastructure inside Russia. That ain't happening today. Right now the big deal is Brittany Griner being arrested. Wow, arrested. In 1985, Arthur Nicholson was shot dead by a Soviet sentry in Ludwigshafen in East Germany. I mean, we were killing each other back then. We were deploying nuclear weapons, not just talking about it. We put the Pershing II into Europe to counter the SS-20. Europe was facing nuclear annihilation to a degree it's not even close to what you're facing today. And yet a man led us out, Ronald Wilson Reagan. Now, I know people are going to say he was a horrible president, horrible. I'm not going to debate that. What I am going to say is he saved the world. He saved the world. And so as bad as things are today, maybe it isn't going to be American leadership, because I don't know where I don't even know how those two words coexist on the same piece of paper today. But maybe Europe will produce, from this total catastrophe that they're facing today, maybe Europe will get a leader worthy of the name. Not Stoltenberg, not Macron, not Schultz, not these jokes, but somebody will emerge who will say, we need to behave like rational, thinking, loving, caring human beings. And if you put all those words together and combine it into one person, these things that we're talking about, they're logical. I mean, it's not like Glenn and Alexander and me are sitting here trying to paint a fanciful world. It is logic to say that we should aspire not to have nuclear weapons. It's logical to say, I'm going to leave it at that, because I'm in a debating contest right now with my dogs. But I think I made my point about it's possible to envision a world where a leader can emerge to get us out of the trouble that we're in.
Agree. Well, on that much more positive note, I think, we can round this up. So, well, let me just say, thank you, Scott, for taking 2 hours of your time, and of course you as well, Alexander. It's been a pleasure, and I hope to talk to both of you again soon.
Indeed.
Well, thank you very much for having me,
Alexander.
Thank you great to see you.
Great to see you, and Glenn, thank you very much for all you've done.
Thank you, Glenn.